Among the granite and marble tombstones at Beechworth Cemetery, 2 men lay buried in this bare patch of earth, this unmarked grave. The men were strangers to one another, but to save space they were buried beside a ditch, one on top of the other. One was an American traveller named George Allen, who died at Beechworth Hospital in the year 1900, aged 65. 19 years later, the grave was reopened for a second man, a patient of Victoria's mental health system, who died without a name. He remained forgotten, an unmarked life in an unmarked grave. Until now. Papers documenting his admission to Kew Asylum in 1908 caught the eye of Melbourne genealogist Kath Ensor. Kath is a part-time student, studying the effects of institutionalisation. She was stunned by what the document failed to tell her. Age, next of kin and marital status were listed as unknown, and written where his name should have been were just the words, man, unknown. He was simply patient number 6509. Kath used this number to track him through the mental health system, discovering transfer papers to Beechworth's Mayday Hills Lunatic Asylum, where he spent the next decade. Later she discovered a death certificate, dated July 3, 1919, which read, Man unknown, aged about 65 years.
He didn't know his own name. He couldn't tell anybody who he was, what had happened to him. There was nothing for this man, nobody to visit, nobody to put flowers on his grave. A lost life. A sadness, really.
Kath began to discover other lost lives, but this time among the living. Through her research and her work as a probate genealogist at financial services organisations State Trustees, she discovered people who had spent their entire lives in orphanages and mental hospitals. As adults living in supported residential housing, or SRSs, many cannot remember where they were born, where they grew up, or even if they have any surviving family. Decades of mental illness, powerful psychiatric medication, years of shock therapy and sometimes illicit drug use have punched holes in their memories.
We all have a right to know our past. They're lost souls, some of those people.
Social worker Sylvia Borelli of Eastern Access Community Health runs outreach programs at SRSs in Melbourne's eastern suburbs. She agrees that loss of memory and identity problems run deep and wide.
In a way, you could draw a comparison to the stolen generation in that they need to establish some sense of identity before they can really move on. There are lots of people, hundreds, perhaps even thousands of people in this situation across Australia. They're the forgotten generation.
Kath met residents at Corondo Home, a supported residential service at Ashwood. She began using her skills as a genealogist to help them remember their lost pasts. She worked closely with 2 residents, Frank and Norman, whose memories were ransacked by lifelong battles with schizophrenia. 63-year-old Norman was left with only a handful of broken recollections of his childhood. He also had a curious fascination with buses that nobody could explain.
He would leave the SRS and go onto the main road and wave to the buses as they went by. He told me that all the bus drivers knew him, and whenever there was an excursion going to a community lunch or to a shopping centre, he was always the first on, sitting in the front seat next to the driver and chatting away. But nobody understood why he had this fascination with buses.
Meanwhile, Kath went to work on Frank's traumatic past. Frank entrusted Kath with one of his most harrowing memories, of his mother, who was killed in a road accident when he was 11 years old. More than 3 decades later, at the age of 45, he couldn't remember where she was buried, and that troubled him.
She went out for dinner one night and didn't come back. Car came over the hill and bowled him over, and my mum got knocked into a coma for so many hours and passed away about three hours later in hospital. I went in and had a look around to try and find what happened to her grave, and I couldn't find it. Yeah, it was a bit upsetting. Yeah.
Kath took to the books. She searched the records of Melbourne cemeteries for Frank's mother. At the same time, she scoured electoral rolls and street directories to piece together Norman's childhood and the reason for his fascination with buses. She visited the neighbourhood where Norman grew up and took photographs. The street where he'd lived in Northcote, and a nearby creek where he'd collected frogs and tadpoles. While standing on the footpath outside his childhood home, she noticed a steady stream of buses and realised Norman had grown up beside a busy bus route. His passion for buses harked back to happier times. She used the photographs to compile a book of facts about his life, a book that's never far from his reach.
And this is where your house used to be?
Used to be there, when it was in there.
Yeah.
Not there now, though.
Can you-
That's there, three, it's all there now.
So when you were little, did you go to the Merry Creek?
Yeah, I know, I can do all that, I believe.
Yeah.
Social worker Sylvia Borelli says Kath's work with Norman has given him confidence to venture into the community for the first time in years.
Now he catches a bus regularly and he participates in a gardening program at the Kevin Hines Centre in Doncaster. There are lots of people like Norman who have been deinstitutionalised but are kind of stuck, still disconnected. The work that Kath's been doing is helping them to kind of reconnect with their past, which helps them move forward, I guess.
Well, no, not far. Either way with that, they said. That's not what
Kath found closure for Frank too, discovering that his mother, Barbara Jean Holtzmuller, was buried at Springvale Cemetery in 1979. On a stormy autumn day, Kath and Sylvia took Frank to visit the grave.
It's just to put some flowers on there, just to have a moment to remember her, yeah. Yeah, it was good that Kath could help me out finding her grave. I felt a lot better when I found her grave, yeah. I used to remember her, every week she would cook up these pasties for us. She used to have a mincer out and everything like that, and she'd cook up these pasties and they were beautiful, you know, I remember that. They were happy times, you know, I remember that.